So welcome everyone. Welcome to our Diversity and Cross-Cultural Task Force this evening. Thank you for joining us. I see many familiar faces as well as some new faces. So we do want to build momentum with this task force and invite you to bring friends and neighbors and colleagues to our future meetings. So tonight we have a special guest. We have April Francis Taylor, the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity at Eastern Suffolk BOCES. And she's here to review tonight the New York State Education Department framework for the culturally responsiveness sustaining education framework. So
yes, you got it, Christine.
So April, I want to welcome you. Thank you for joining us this evening and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Riverhead family. I'm going to share my screen. So I'll get started. So yes, this is the, as Christine just shared, it's the introduction to the New York State Education Department, their DEI, and their culturally responsive and sustaining education framework. And really just understanding what it is and how it can help Riverhead in doing the work that that you all are doing to help support all of your students to be their best, right? And give them those opportunities. So just a little bit about myself. As mentioned, I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity at Eastern Suffolk BOCES. Prior to that, I was an administrator in Westchester school systems. I worked in Mamaroneck as a Director of Student Life, participating in culturally responsive pedagogy and restorative practices and supporting the district in those areas. And prior to that, I was a social studies director and teacher. So originally from Long Island, and I was in Westchester for a few years, and then I came back for this great position in Eastern Suffolk BOCES to work with all of the Suffolk County districts around this topic. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be a support. So just some assumptions. We're going to talk about assumptions and norms today. The assumptions are that we are all well-intended, good people who want to see all of our children succeed in school. No one of us has all the answers to the many complex questions about the equity issues facing your schools and community. And some of us would much rather not talk about these equity issues as they relate to socioeconomic status and race, but we agree to enter into this conversation under the agreement of trust and goodwill. So just some virtual protocols in the room. We're going to talk about this acronym BRAVING in a second. We want to ensure that we are muted, and I see everybody's used to that. We want to, feel free to use the chat room when someone is sharing and you want to share your thoughts at the same time. If you have the ability, stay engaged and be present as much as possible, because sometimes we will go into breakout rooms to have a short conversation about some of the topics that we're going to share today. Share your appreciation for colleagues and friends and community members who braved through our conversation. And as always, let's be kind, courteous, and civil in our conversations. So something that Brene Brown says. Brene Brown is a motivational speaker. She's written books. One that stands out is Dare to Lead. And she says there are 7 elements of the term trust. She says, and those elements are in this acronym of BRAVING. It's boundaries, reliability, accountability, the vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. So she talks about that as the anatomy of trust. So when we have these conversations on topics that are helping us to grow together and really have personal self-reflection and talk about things that we often might feel a little uncomfortable, it's good to have some type of norms to know which one, it's good to have norms to know when to lean on those norms so that you can continue to have conversations that might be uncomfortable. So as I mentioned here, you really can't see this well, so I am going to step out for a second. And it's here, give you a chance to look at the norms. And if you can put in the chat, if you have the ability to, after I read the norms, just put which one really resonates with you when having these conversations. So When she says boundaries, she says, you respect my boundaries. And when you're not clear about what's okay and not okay, you ask, you're willing to say no. Reliability is you do what you say you'll do at work or working with communities. This means staying aware of our limitations and our competencies so that we don't overpromise and we're able to deliver on commitments. Accountability, you own your own mistakes, apologize, and make amends. The vault, you don't share information or experiences that are not yours to share. So I need to know that my confidences are kept and that you're not sharing with me any information about other people that should be confidential. Integrity, you choose courage over comfort. You choose what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy. And you choose to practice your values rather than simply professing them. Non-judgment, I can ask for what I need and you can ask for what you need. We can talk about how we feel without judgment. And generosity, you extend the most generous interpretation possible to the intentions, words, and actions of others. So those are the braving norms. So if you can, in the chat, just write which one resonates with you the most. And while you do that, I will talk about what we're going to go over today. So we're going to explore the foundational elements of the culture and culturally responsive education. We're going to reflect on our own personal culture and experiences. We're going to become familiar with the DEI policy and the CRSE framework. And we're going to reflect on ways and practices and approaches outlined in the framework to help see where we already are and how we can adapt new ones. All right, so Christine, what are some of the elements of trust that you see in the chat?
All right, so I see accountability, integrity multiple times, generosity, the vault, non-judgment, accountability, non-judgment, generosity, integrity, generosity, reliability and accountability, non-judgment and generosity, vault, non-judgment and integrity, non-judgmental and vault.
All right, so we have different places that we're at. So it's good to center where you are and also see where others are in this room as we have these conversations, because one element might be a little bit more important to someone else, and we just want to be cognizant of that when we have the conversation. So thank you all for sharing in the chat. All right, so that brings us to this quote by Simon Sinek. Simon Sinek is also a motivational speaker, and he says, and it's those who start with why that have the ability to inspire those around them or find others who inspire them. So he has this concept of the golden circle. And he says the golden circle is really what organizations, whether you're a school or a business, understanding your why is really one of the main important pieces of being able to have a large impact and to be successful. So when he says, most companies know what they do, right? As an educational organization, we teach children. As parents and families, we send our children to school to learn. And we know how that happens, right? Teachers have lesson plans, there's field trips, there's assessments, and then we have graduations and such. But the why piece is the big part. Why do we do what we do? Why do we send our kids to schools? Why do we have schools? And what is really, and why are schools so important for our young people? So when we think about it in that context, it kind of becomes more of a visionary aspect than just what we do. In the same way, you all have taken your time out this evening to come and talk about this topic of diversity, equity, inclusion, and culturally responsiveness. And that means that you have a why. So what I'd like us to do is if we can go into breakout rooms, and if you can introduce yourself, if you already know each other, that's fine. You can do a check-in and say hello, and just share your why around the DEI work that you are participating within your district with here in Riverhead. What is your why for being here this evening and showing up to have this conversation? So Christine, are you able to do groups of about 4 to 5? I say about four people.
Yeah, we have 25 people. I'll make 6 groups.
Okay.
All right, so everyone just, once I hit create, if you haven't done this before, you're magically going to be transported into another group. You can just say join group when it comes up on your screen, and then April will let me know. April, how long do you want to give them?
We'll do about 6 minutes.
Okay, so in 6 minutes, you'll be transported back to the main group. So have fun, everyone.
Okay, so I think we're all back. Christine, could you pause recording for 1 second?
Sure.
Thank you. Oh, thanks, Christine. Is at the top of the list for everyone. So in 2018, the Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework came out. That's the document with the hands. And then in April of 2021, our Board of Regents created a call to action. And they said, they asked districts to, and I'll give you a link to the documents. So they said to districts, we wanna let you know that we are trying to ensure that all students are seen and that all students are able to have equal opportunities and access to resources, that it's not more so about an achievement gap, but it's more about an opportunity gap, and how we as educators really have to look at the systems and see what we're doing really good and the areas that we need to improve on. I don't know why it's presenting like this. 1 second. So then in May 2021, they came out with the DEI policy. And we're going to look at just a piece of that, because one thing that they do is ground us on definitions. I'm sorry about that. Here we go. So everyone has the link. So in the DEI policy, they define what diversity, equity, and inclusion means as regards to school systems. So it says that diversity includes, but is not limited to, race, color, ethnicity, nationality, religion, socioeconomic status, veteran status, education, marital status, language, age, gender, gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, mental or physical ability, genetic information, and learning styles, right? So all of that is considered diversity. And oftentimes we think about, they say we want to hire diverse people. It's more about hiring or bringing those who are going to bring a diversity to the group, right? So when we think about diversity, we don't want to think about a person being diverse. We want to think about a person bringing diversity to the group. The state says that inclusion, when they refer to inclusion, they're saying that authentically bringing traditionally excluded individuals and or groups into process, activities, and decision policymaking in a way that shares power and ensures equal access to opportunities and resources, right? So this piece there's an analogy. Diversity is being asked to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. And the idea that now your voice is being heard, you're part of the group, and that you're valued in that way. And equity is a guarantee of fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all, while striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of all groups. So equity recognizes that that our systems have created barriers for some and have created advantages for others. And so we're looking at how can we create more of an equitable system for everyone. So in the policy, they have these 5 components. It says governance is, oh, it doesn't, yep. One of the components is governance. Establish a district, they ask districts to establish a DEI committee that is representative of all stakeholders, including students. So right now, you all are participating or in governance, right? This conversation you're having, you coming in the evening and giving your input is part of this policy. Teaching and learning has addressed the need for inclusive and culturally responsive teaching and learning. So we're doing that too. We're going to be learning about these topics and terms so that we can turnkey and share it with others. Family and community engagement. Ensure that family and community engagement practices are based on mutual trust, confidence, and respect. Encourage participation in community building conversations. It was said in the report out before that valuing folks, our student voices and our community voices so that we can do better and progress. Workforce diversity. Recruit and retain a diverse workforce in all areas and at all levels, thereby reducing stereotypes and preparing students for an increasingly global society. And then finally, student supports, discipline, and wellness. We want to focus on the well-being of the whole child by always considering and addressing the full range of student developmental pathways. All right. So you're more than welcome if you have a question or anything, and that you can put that in the chat, and Christine is there. She'll be able to let me know if there's a question. So now that we know NYSERD's why, we're going to talk about the how. They said this is why. We want all students to be valued. We're educating the whole child. And the how is we're going to give you some strategies and practices that you can adopt to get there. And that's this framework. And we just call it the CRSE for short, but the Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework. And one thing we have to understand, and here's a lot of education acronyms for those who aren't educators, for our family members. RTI means response to intervention, SEL is social emotional learning, APPR is the evaluation for system for teachers, and we know content standards are like math, science, social studies, English, physical education, and assessments, the state exams that kids take, right? So we have a lot of things going on in schools, but we want to understand that culturally responsive sustaining the framework is not another initiative. It's really the plate, right? It's what we do. It's valuing our children and all of those other things. If we're being culturally responsive, we're able to attain those other things that are on the plate. So let me just, I just want to make sure you all have access to the documents. So let me get it here and I'll put it in the chat for those who like to follow along. So in 2018, the state gave a call out to educators who were interested in or have been doing equity work to help review this framework. So this framework was created with teachers, administrators, parents, families, community advocate groups. So it was very, and it was across the state. They had committees in Rochester, in the North Country, right here in New York City that had Westchester and Long Island folks. And so it's a great opportunity. I was able to help and see this come to life. And a big piece of what everyone would say when we got together is ensuring that all of our students felt the same, students felt that they could show up as their full selves. And I was sharing that in our breakout room. So on page 10 of this framework, it says that culturally responsive sustaining education is grounded in a cultural view of learning and human development in which multiple expressions of diversity, which all of those, we talked about those terms, are recognized and regarded as assets for teaching and learning, right? So when our students show up, however they come to us, that's an asset. We want to see what are their strengths so that we can build on that, and then find out the areas that they need support in so we can also build on that. But we want them to see themselves as having, not as a blank slate, but already their experiences as people, as young people, are valued in the education that we're doing. And to be able to do that, we have to understand some terms around culturally responsive education. And the main term that we see in that framework is culture. So there's a graphic here about culture, and the framework gives a definition. It So it says that NYSET understands culture as the multiple components of one's identity, including, but not limited to, your race, economic background, gender, language, sexual orientation, nationality, religion, and ability. Culture far transcends practices such as cuisines, art, music, and celebrations to also include ways of thinking, values, and forms of expression. So if you look at this graphic here, right, everyone in this breakout room has culture. It's how we behave. It's the customs that we have that maybe we learned from growing up from our family, or maybe we created as adults. It's the language we speak. It's our beliefs. It's our attitudes. It's the music that we listen to, the art that we enjoy, the food that we eat, the faith or religion that we have. So all of us have culture. And we know that there are umbrella cultures as well, but when we think about those umbrella cultures, we then have to think about who we are as individuals too. And that brings us to Richard T. Hall's iceberg of culture. So Richard says, who we are as people have three main levels. Similar to an iceberg, the least amount, when we look at an iceberg or the tip of it that's above the sea level, that is the smallest portion of what makes somebody someone. Right, so that surface level, the visible piece that we can see of someone, that's only the beginning of who they are. The majority of who someone is less visible, it's below surface. So you have the visible part is you can see race, you can see a gender or perceived gender, you can hear someone's language, you can get an idea of their age and their physical characteristics. But the less visible is their pattern of speech, their ethnicity, their favorite foods, the festivals or family traditions that they have. And even deeper, that's truly not visible and lives in our unconscious mind, is our personal values, our sexual identity, our thought patterns, our assumptions, some of our views and attitudes. So I'll give you, for instance, for me, surface level, you can see I am a Black female, a Black woman, and I do go by my pronouns as she, her. But right below the surface, my ethnicity is Caribbean American, because my parents are from the Caribbean. So a lot of the food I eat and the music I listen to, really connects to that larger cultural group. And then you can always go deeper. Our experiences as people impact how we act every day. So what I'd like us to do in using the chat box is just share what is something you love about your culture. When you think about, the food that you like, or traditions that you have, or experiences that you've had, what is something positive that comes to mind? And I'll give people a minute to think about that. And as people are filling it up, if you feel you want to brave through and share what you wrote and why, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself. And we'll pause the recording for a second. That are taking people that's having those blinders will then, it's not our fault, right? We grew up how we grew up. But now that we are more cognizant of things, we have to understand that there are different types of bias. And once we understand that, we can once again continue to do better. So when we talk about bias, explicit bias is the bias that is expressed directly, people are aware of it, they operate consciously, and those are that explicit bias leads to prejudice and the isms like racism and genderism and sexism, right? So that is more out there in the front. Implicit bias is expressed indirectly, you're unaware of it, and it operates subconsciously, right? It's just part of, who we are at this point. And what our brain does is when they see experiences of see something or experience something that connects to the past, then your brain connects it to what you already know, and then you have a bias towards that. And the bias could be positive and the bias can be negative. But being cognizant that our brain does that will help us in doing the work that we are trying to do around DEI, right? So knowing that bias, whether it's explicit or implicit, can also lead to what we call stereotypes. And part of that DEI policies talks about single stories. So we're going to listen to a TED Talk, a piece of a TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a Nigerian American author, where she in 2009 talked about the danger of a single story. And in this share, it's actually 18 minutes, but we're only going to watch a few minutes of it, about 8 minutes, I would say. She's going to talk about her experience of displaying implicit bias, her experience with explicit bias and microaggressions, and then, you know, what the danger of a single story can do. I'll just pause it for a second. Though this is a TED Talk, this is actually someone took the TED Talk and made one of those graphics. So as you hear Chimamanda speaking, you're going to see the drawings just to give you some type of picture to what she's saying.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria, I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow, we ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the Black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I, too, am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become.
Oh, sorry. So I'm going to pause it here. And as I said, that was actually just clips from it. There's the full version I can share with Christine, and she can send to the group if you ever want to watch it, or you can Google it. Put it in YouTube and you'll see the full story. So in the end, she's saying that, that the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make the one story become the only story. So what I'd like us to do is just to go back into our breakout rooms and just talk about how do our school systems at times create single stories of our students. So how do our school systems at times create single stories of our students? And we'll just talk for about 6 minutes again.
Okay, I'm going to pause the recording.
The framework is to do better. So as you know, what was just said, our systems have had a negative impact in a disproportionate way on marginalized groups such as our students of color, particularly our Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students, males with low academic performance, students of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, students who identify in the LGBTQ community, and our students with disabilities. And this political cartoon set is basically showing how our systems have inequities, right? Systemic racism has played a major role in a lot of what we're experiencing today. So if your system starts out inequitable, right, you can't expect everyone to be as successful. And so once we understand that, we have to start fixing. So here is a graphic that really helps what is educational equity. Well, inequality, as you can see with this tree, the tree is bent, most of the fruit is on one side of the tree, and so that child that's on that side can get a lot of fruit and the other child's really not getting anything. Equality says, okay, well, we're going to give everyone a ladder, we'll give everyone the same tool, but the tree is still bent and most of the fruits are growing on that left side of the tree. Equity says, well, it customizes whatever tools or resources are needed to give access and opportunity. Right, so it says, okay, well, we know on this side of the tree is not that many fruit, so let's make this ladder a little higher. But true justice and really knocking down barriers that have inequities is fixing the system, right? As you can see, the tree is now, straight, and because it's straight, it's getting all the sunlight, and so now the fruits are able to grow on both sides of the tree. Right, a lot of our systems are working between equality and equity, but we really want to get to this system of justice where we are fixing, not just giving resources, but we are fixing the system to then have this equitable society that everyone is able to have access. There's another graphic of that, right? When the pandemic hit, giving the tool, the bike would be the tablet or the laptop, right? Everyone got a laptop, but everyone's home situation was different. So equality was everyone gets a device, but equity was, well, we needed to look at people's home situations and make it sure that whatever supports they needed would help them while they were in remote learning. And even what we're doing today, how are we engaging with the different families that we have to ensure we're meeting the various needs. So the culturally responsive and sustaining framework really, I think I gave you guys this already, so I don't have to do that again, really is what shows us how to do that. It says that students and their families should be valued. Culture is not an addition, but is a critical component of education. and self-reflection is required to dismantle systems of bias and inequities. So courageous conversations and bravest conversations like we're having right now is that self-reflection. And then we're able to then say and see where we are so that we can do better. Culturally responsive education says that we're teaching the students in front of us, but however, culturally responsive education must also be sustaining, that it must work to encourage cultural pluralism and not cultural assimilation, right? So the experience of one of our friends in this group speaking about a book that she read and how it made her feel, that was not helping her feel that there was cultural pluralism. That was more about assimilation. Here's a great quote: "The whole purpose of education is to turn mirrors into windows," right? So if we want our students to see themselves, but we also want them to see others, right? And it's specifically those groups that have been traditionally left out, we want to be more inclusive and ensure that there are diverse books and histories being taught so that our students are getting a holistic view of themselves and others. We don't have time for this activity, but there's something that you might want to do as a group. Now that you understand what cultural responsiveness is to say, where are you on this continuum, right? And non-judgment, you can be all the way at constructive, cultural destructiveness. Somebody might be there in the district, but how do we get them to cultural proficiency, right? So knowing that someone might be somewhere on this continuum, and it is our job as a task force such as this to help them move towards being more culturally competent and more culturally proficient. So the framework gives us 4 ways to do that. One, it has the first principle is saying that we need to create welcoming and affirming environments for our students and their families. Principle 2 says we need to foster high expectations and rigorous instruction for our students. We need to identify inclusive curriculum and assessment, and we need to participate in ongoing professional learning and support around topics such as these. So the framework is 64 pages, but all 64 pages doesn't pertain to everyone. What it did was it said that for those 4 principles, the various stakeholders can take actions that will help them become more culturally responsive. So you have the stakeholders include district leaders, school building leaders, teachers, students, families and community members, higher education folks, and New York State Education Department themselves. So here we're looking at the school leaders and the district leaders. Here's families and community engagement. So when you go to the area that pertains to you, and for this group, I would suggest going to page 42. On page 42, that's what you're looking at, a snapshot here. It says, how can community and family groups create a welcoming and affirming environment? One way is to set goals with your children toward their future aspirations and collaborate with teachers to make plans about achieving them. Then the other principle, it says fostering high expectations and rigorous instruction. So let's just look at one of those bullets, because I know it's a little blurry, right? The first bullet here says, be aware of and collaboratively, oh man, I'm having tongue-tied tonight, advocate for, let's back up. So you want to be aware of and collaborate with your child or school and advocate for children having access to a wide range of educational coursework and programming. So if that's something you've never done, right? You look at that bullet and say, wow, I've never done that. That's something you would want to circle and start thinking about. How can I set that as a goal? As a member of this task force, what can I do to help ensure that I am collaborating and advocating for certain coursework and programs for students? And to be able to do that, you have to know what's being offered already. You'd have to have an idea of what some of the content standards are and seeing how you can work with the school to help it come alive. It might be some histories or some experience that you have that you can come and volunteer and partner with a teacher to help teach certain things. So I know when it comes to the topic of teaching, Black history, you may not have a lot of Black and Brown social studies teachers, but you might have a lot of Black and Brown community members that have histories that they can share and partner with the school to talk about the history of Riverhead and the Black history of Riverhead. So that's just an example. But there's other bullets there too that you can look at. So you can say, are we already doing this well? Or is it something we're approaching? We kind of talked about it before, but we haven't actionized it. Or is it something I never even thought about and that we can set as a goal as a group? So the what? So once you go over that framework, right, you look at some of those bullets, you have conversations amongst yourselves, and you start setting some priorities and goals around equity work. You want to then start seeing what's the next step to ensuring that this stuff happens. Well, one step is having these conversations with community members and other teachers and sharing what you're learning. That's that ongoing learning part. What is culture? What's cultural proficiency? What's equality versus equity? What's implicit bias, right? Some of the things we talked about here. We didn't speak about how to become an anti-racist, but those are terms too that, workshops that you can participate in to learn and turnkey. What's in our curriculums. So once you give people that knowledge, then you can also do a self-assessment. Look at where you are as a district. You can score yourself, and that score, you want to be honest, you want to brave through and say, okay, we might be at a 2 in this area, but how do we get to the 3 or 4? How do we become more community driven? How do we engage folks more? How do we become more inclusive? So you can, and there's various tools out there and curriculum scorecards and reviews to make your curriculums more inclusive. And then you want to start action planning. I have some links here to some districts who have done equity plans around DEI. So Mamaroneck School District, you have Garrison Union Free School District, Nyack School District, Eastern Suffolk BOCES has their DEI board policy. So those are some examples of next steps. Once you know what your priorities and goals are, you now have to start action planning and beginning to look at your policies. Because remember, we want to fix the tree. We don't want the tree to stay crooked. To change and fix that tree, we have to look at policy and procedures and start updating them to be more equitable. So in closing, I just want you to think about what are your next steps in your district's journey to more equitable systems and practices? And what is one takeaway that you have for today? So this is more of a larger question for the group, but for closing of this evening, I'd love for folks to share in the chat, what is one takeaway you're going to have for this evening? And I'll give you a moment to type that. All right, so I'm going to start reading some of the shares, and feel free to unmute once you share. If you want to share out loud, you can do that. So someone wrote, self-assessment isn't a one-shot deal. Yes, it's a continuous thing, especially as we learn more about these topics of growth. And even doing, specifically the work around DEI all the time, I'm still learning as well. And I'm always open to new experiences and hearing from others' lived experiences, which are part of the, that qualitative data, understanding others. Somebody wrote, building an inclusive curriculum means not telling a single story and not having a single story about the kids in the class. Yes, definitely. To continue to learn about others' experiences, the dangers of the single story, we all come into contact with, every day, and learning to push beyond it. That's the key part, right? The action step. We come in contact, but how do we push beyond it? How are we going to disrupt those systems in a way that's respectful and helpful? Okay. So we got someone is agreeing with what Ronnie said. Take action in our district by continuing to work on our DEI plan. Yes. Oh, thank you, Lawrence. One takeaway is that this plan is doable for everyone. Yes. Yep. And that's from the top, from all, I won't even say from the top down, that's from all stakeholders. We all are equal in this journey of education. And that's one thing we have to, that cultural pluralism is important to remember. Stereotypes are not complete stories. All right. So Miss Tona, if you can stop recording for a second.
Thank you so much, April. I'm always inspired. This is, I think, the third or fourth time I've heard April speak, and I learned something more. This is a journey, and many of us have been on this journey since the inception of this diversity and cross-cultural task force. So I thank you for doing this work. So the next steps, I know Mr. Street mentioned it twice in the chat. Yes, as April was presenting the next steps pieces and looking at the framework, I think at our next meeting, which is November 30th at 6 p.m., that's where we pick up and we start having conversations about the framework itself and what does this group feel is needed. We mentioned at the beginning that we are working on an equity plan this year. So after the last meeting, I sent out a survey to the attendees to get feedback on the session and also to find out who's interested in serving on a smaller task force to create the equity plan. So this larger task force will help inform what the plan is going to look like, but then there'll be a smaller group who will be tasked with actually writing it and putting it together. And it's not going to be me and a few administrators writing this plan. It's going to be representatives from the community, teachers, students, parents. I'll look it over, I'll help you. I want to facilitate with you, but I don't want the plan to come from me and a group of administrators. It should come from the community. So I'm going to send out another survey tomorrow or Monday to this group to get your feedback. And again, to ask if anyone wants to be part of the smaller task force to write the plan. I thank those that have already indicated interest. We're considering everyone. We're just going to put it out also to the community at large, post it on the website, the survey of who wants to be part of the equity plan, because I know not everyone's available to join us on these evening workshops, but I don't want to discount anybody who's interested in working on that equity plan as well. So any questions or comments before we end tonight's session? Or you can write in the chat. I'm looking at that as well. I see April, you got a lot of thank yous there.
Yes, I saw it. Thank you, everyone. Like I mentioned, it was really great working with you all and being in the breakout room and meeting some folks. And I look forward to, Christine doesn't mind inviting me back and supporting you as you are, working on that equity plan, and really lean on that framework to give you some guidance, because that is common language. It brings everybody together, and then it helps give you a guide to the next step. So it's not trying to figure it out. They kind of really mapped it out, and it's allowing you to then be the leaders in your district to see it move forward. So.
Yeah, and I think seeing that framework in action tonight made it a little less scary about what it is entailing. And, it's coming from a positive place. And, you've heard me say before, it's about allowing all of our students to feel a sense of belonging and allowing them to learn how to accept others and become adults that will accept others for who they are, listen to multiple perspectives, and then weigh in with knowledge based on information that they've researched and the different perspectives that they've listened to.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'll put the link to the, are you going to send the presentation to folks, Christine?
Yes.
Okay. And I would encourage anyone who wants to unpack implicit bias a little bit more. The Harvard implicit bias test is really powerful. They have a bunch of things a bunch of categories to look at. So that helps you with reflecting on your doing your self-assessment and your own self-reflection around this topic. So All right, I'm done.
All right, so thanks to everyone for being part of tonight's session. It was fantastic, and this is our second meeting, and I'm so inspired by everyone's dedication to this work. So thank you.